honored guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. Welcome to the second South African International Conference of Entrepreneurship. My name is Kerrin Myres and I'm the Director of the Centre for Entrepreneurship here at Wits Business School. This conference brings together the wisdom and insights of academics and practitioners from across the African continent, and indeed the world. These insights come from diverse places, but they have one goal: to grow and develop entrepreneurial startups and practice to the benefit of all Africans. This is not a trivial exercise, and it is also not a goal which is easily achieved. Relative to other disciplines, we still know little about African entrepreneurs, and I therefore invite you to engage actively with the scholars and with each other in the next 2 days. Question, argue, as South Africans we're very good at that, enjoy. We as academics and practitioners are in the process of discovery, and there is much here to challenge and excite us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I declare the second South African International Conference of Entrepreneurship open. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Professor Scott Shane, the Malachi Mixon Professor of Entrepreneurial Studies at Weatherhead School of Management, Case Western University.
The topic of the presentation today is the illusions of entrepreneurship, lessons for public policy. And the idea behind this is to take lessons from my book, The Illusions of Entrepreneurship, and say what it is that is the message for that in understanding entrepreneurship from the perspective of public policymakers. Here I am defining entrepreneurship as the situation when people start and run their own businesses. Pretty straightforward definition. That's entrepreneurship as defined through this presentation. Eddie Lazier, who's a well-known economist, had this quote about what an entrepreneur is that sort of sums up the perspective about entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur is the single most important player in the modern economy. Create more startups. They're very important because if you have more new businesses, you will transform depressed economic regions. You will generate huge amounts of innovation, and you will create large numbers of jobs. That kind of perspective on entrepreneurship would actually give you the impression that the first thing that any policymaker is going to want to do is run out and grab as many entrepreneurs as they possibly can, because that's the solution to all kinds of problems. The problem with that is that it is actually based on a false premise. And that false premise is that the typical startup doesn't do any of these things that policymakers and academics and the person on the street would like them to do. The typical startup business is not at all innovative. In fact, very, very few startups are. The typical startup creates virtually no jobs, and the typical startup generates little wealth. In survey across survey around the globe, when you ask people why they start businesses, the number one reason that they give is to avoid having a boss. And this is important because if people are starting businesses because they don't want to work for somebody else, that is a different model than the model that underlies what a lot of policymakers hope is the reason why people are starting businesses. Most entrepreneurs, we have to keep in mind, are not interested in generating wealth or creating jobs. So we survey people and we ask them, what do you want to do? The majority of entrepreneurs say, I don't want to increase sales. I don't care. I don't want to have growth in employment. The problem is that if you don't aspire to do something, your odds of achieving it are actually quite low. And if policymakers are under a model that entrepreneurs are trying to add jobs and grow businesses and generate wealth, and that's not their goal, then there's a mismatch there. The typical startup is dead in 5 years. Think about that. The median entrepreneur, the typical entrepreneur, runs a failed business. essentially, entrepreneurs make less and work harder. In general, there are exceptions, of course. Now, from a policy point of view, and to think about this from the perspective of economic growth, you want to have productivity. So how productive are startups? Well, there's some careful work on U.S. Census data that was done by John Haltwanger at the University of Maryland and some of his colleagues. And one of the things that research shows on sample after sample is productivity actually increases with firm age. New businesses are less productive than older businesses. Now I want to tackle another illusion that's out there, which is this one that entrepreneurship causes economic growth. It doesn't. The opportunity cost of running a business goes up. So people will say, well, wait, why should I be running my own business? I can get a good job working for someone else, and they shift to working for someone else. In addition, as countries get richer, they shift from agriculture, where self-employment is more common, to manufacturing, where it's less common, and actually the percentage of the population running businesses drops. If we look at the relationship between real GDP growth and self-employment rate, we see studies that show in France, West Germany, and Italy between 1953 and 1987, and Sweden between 1962 and 1987, a negative correlation. And in fact, there was a nice study that was done by Danny Blanchflower at Dartmouth University that looked at the correlation between real GNP growth rates and the rate of self-employment from 1975 to 1986 in 19 OECD countries, and it's negative. Places with more startups actually have fewer high-growth companies. Why is that? Well, it's actually pretty logical if you examine the patterns. If you have lots of high-growth companies, that means that you have lots of jobs. If you have lots of jobs available and those jobs are good and they pay well, people take them. If people take them, they're not starting businesses. So the opportunity cost to starting a business is high in places with lots of good growing economies. Where new businesses create jobs is in their first few months, because they go from zero to creating jobs. And after that, the survivors do less than those dying in terms of job creation. The implication is that getting economic growth and job creation from entrepreneurs is not the numbers game that many policymakers think it is. It's actually a quality game. It's about encouraging the formation of high-quality, high-growth companies. Not more companies, but more of certain companies. If I can tell you which businesses have an extremely high probability of going nowhere, and we don't give them anything, then on average, the ones we give something to will have a higher probability of success. So what policymakers should do, if they're really concerned about this question, is just think like venture capitalists. We know a lot of things that predict which businesses are more likely to be successful. The human capital of the founder is one, so take a look at that. Look at their education, look at their work experience. We know that people with more industry experience in their industry, we know that people with more education tend to be more successful as entrepreneurs. Look at the industry in which the company is founded. We know that some industries have much higher growth rates of startups than others. So you stop encouraging the formation of typical startups by stopping transfer payments, loans, subsidies, regulatory exemptions, and tax benefits to encourage more and more people to start businesses, and you reallocate resources to policies that support high-growth companies. You also know that on average, people are much happier being entrepreneurs. So there's nothing wrong with a policy that says we're going to start businesses because it makes our citizens happier, or we're going to do this because we want to subsidize people who are unemployed and don't have anything else to do. My point is, don't say A and do B.